It's been a while since I put together a video, and normally the videos that I want to put together are going to be based off of my experiences, what has worked for me in the past, things that have failed for me, and what I do today on my farms and with my hunting, with my goals of hunting and killing giant bucks. This video is going to be a little different, and it's probably a video that if I'd have looked back maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I probably would have never seen myself giving this, if you want to call it pitch, or giving this idea or option for food plotters, and that's irrigating food plots. 5 or 10 years ago, I probably would have thought this was a ridiculous idea. Just because it seemed to me at the time or in the past as being very labor intensive, very costly, and just kind of a ridiculous thing that you would ever irrigate a food plot. But fast forward to today, and it seems like there's a big push by some YouTube stars and some TV personalities to really spend a lot of money in no-till grain drills and roller crimpers and different seed blends, spring, summer, fall, for regenerative agriculture. And I'm not against any of that. I know I sound negative when I say it that way, but I'm really not against that. But for most hunters that I know, spending $10,000 or $15,000 on a grain drill, more money on a roller crimper, maybe more money on a tractor that's able to pull this stuff is just, it's not a realistic or economical thing to do to put in maybe 4 acres of food plots. And that seems to be, it's not really a formal survey, but out of all the hunters that I know, all the friends and family and just hunters that I know, and that's, you know, dozens and dozens of hunters that I communicate with every year, it seems to be about 4 acres, 3, 4, 5 acres is the norm when putting in food plots. And I know there's guys out there putting in 10 and 20 and 30 acres of food plots, and I think that's a different category. Again, not trying to be negative about those guys, but most guys that are doing this are putting in 1 or 2 acres. Maybe it's a couple small green plots a year. Maybe they'll have a 2 or 3 acre destination soybean or corn food plot. And I think to spend realistically $20,000 or $25,000 on some of this equipment and then the seed every year to practice the regenerative agriculture practices on such a small scale is really not that economical for most hunters. Now, if you can combine that kind of stuff with a production agriculture system, I think it's great. Or if you have the extra money to go out and buy this stuff, I also think it's great. But I think there's an alternative that I really didn't look at a few years back, and that's irrigating food plots. So I want to talk about a really good friend of mine who's been irrigating food plots, I want to say maybe 4 or 5, 6 years, and he has about 2 or 3 acres of food plots. And at the time, I kind of, if I was honest with myself, I probably rolled my eyes a little bit. And I said, why are you doing that? Instead, you should be doing no-till beans, and you should be putting in cover crops. But again, going back, no access to a no-till planter. He could have put cover crops in, but then the only way to plant in those cover crops would be through heavy tillage again, because no access to any kind of no-till equipment. And this same friend of mine I've mentioned before in past videos, he really likes tractor time. So he has the equipment to do the conventional style tillage, and he actually has some old grain drills where he can put in his soybeans, maybe if it's a legume crop, with the old style conventional tillage type drills. He has access to that stuff. So again, to go out and buy the no-till equipment for someone like that is probably just not too reasonable. And in his area, there's no really access as far as rentals through NRCS or something like that. What really triggered me is a couple years ago, I did a consultation for a hunter who lives in a high water table, low quality, poor soil conditions. It's very rocky, very sandy. But this hunter had access to water. Almost unlimited access, especially if you look at about a 4 or 5 acre food plot. And in this consultation, in this plan, what we determined would be very successful for this farm was establishing about a 4 acre destination plot. And at the time I said corn and soybeans, kind of a corn and soybean rotation, maybe 2 acres of each. and then swapping them every year. And without getting into the consultation and the hunter's specific goals and why we wanted to do this, because that's really not what this video is about, we just said that a grain food plot for the November time period is really what he needed to attract and hold deer on his property through that November time frame, which was peak hunting pressure time frame, whether that's archery season or a high-powered gun season in this area. And I'm purposely being vague about where this is because this hunter did not want me using his name or specific location, because we really feel that this 4-acre destination food plot of corn and soybeans is almost a competitive advantage he has over other hunters in the area, specifically because he's willing to irrigate and he's put in the resources in the equipment and stuff to be able to irrigate this destination food plot when probably none of the other hunters in the area are going to do the same thing. About a month ago, I was on this hunter's land and he was willing to show me his irrigation setup, and I kind of picked his brains because I wanted to know what does this cost? How labor intensive is this? Is this actually like work? Is this hard to do? Is it very time consuming? Are you having to go out and disturb your property all the time? So I was able to interview him and really kind of take down some notes, and I kind of want to go through those with you. So the first thing is he had to get the infrastructure to be able to irrigate. And for him, that's 3-inch aluminum line. I think there might have been some 2-inch aluminum in there. He had to get some irrigation guns. He had to buy a pump, an irrigation pump. But the one thing this hunter had already was access to a water source. And again, like I said, it was almost unlimited, especially if you look at a 4 or 5 acre food plot. Having said that, he acquired the irrigation guns, the pump, and the pipe for under $1,000. Now that's probably not realistic for most guys that are wanting to do this, strictly because this guy has kind of connections in different industries, and he was probably able to get a pretty good deal on this stuff by waiting a long period of time and kind of doing some shopping, and he was willing to travel to different states to pick some of this stuff up. So I said, hey, if you didn't have the resources you have, the connections you have, realistically, how much would this cost in infrastructure, not on a yearly basis with basically just gas to supply the pump? How much would this have cost you for the normal guy? And it was under $5,000, if not $2,000 or $3,000 for the pipe and the guns and the pump. It was probably $5,000 or less. So I'm looking at that and I'm saying, a 4 or 5 acre destination food plot, unlimited supply of water, again, because he had a water source, but for under $5,000, and he's guaranteed to have rain. He's guaranteed to have rain on his destination food plot, whether he plants corn, soybeans, alfalfa out there, a late fall plot, whatever it ends up being, he's guaranteed rain. Now imagine not ever having to sit there and stare at your phone for weeks on end and going through a drought like we have here in 2023 across the Midwest. I don't know how many hunters I've talked to who have had total, complete failures of their soybean or corn plots because of massive drought, severe and extreme drought in different parts of the Midwest. And it's kind of, I shouldn't say funny, but it's kind of ironic that I'm doing this video about this irrigation in a year where in this area where he's irrigating, there's severe drought and there's crop failure. And yet his soybeans look phenomenal this year. So I'm comparing, when I'm saying an economical option for hunters to be able to have a successful food plot when you're worried about moisture levels or when you're worried about rainfall or having enough rain. And I'm going to go and say that irrigation for $5,000 or less in this example, because you have access to water, to me seems like a far more economical and guaranteed result than spending $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, even $30,000 on the equipment in a no-till grain drill, roller crimper, etc., to have to choose that method. If you're already practicing the different methods of using a no-till grain drill and roller crimpers, and you've bought that infrastructure, you bought that equipment, I'm not cutting that down. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that for a lot of hunters, that's probably outside of the price range of what they can afford. It's not economical, and it's hard to justify on, like, again, 1 or 2 or 3 acres. All I'm saying is this might be an option for people. So I want to just give some examples because we talked about this a lot in the field. The one example is you have a high water table but poor quality soils. So it's sandy soil, rocky soil, a lot of what you'll find in Michigan, north central Wisconsin, where the soil quality is subpar, but yet you want to hunt deer there and you want to grow food plots, and you have a high water table. You have some options. You can dig a pond, you can dredge a ditch, like a scrape, what they call, to get enough water. You can pound a shallow well point and use a gas pump. And all these methods in those examples can give you almost an unlimited amount of water, especially when you're talking about small acreages. In hilly country, if you live where there's a lot of hills or bluffs, you can actually put a dam between 2 hills and dam up and make a pond. Where I live, that's very common. There's ponds all over the place for watering cattle and even just for fishing holes, and that's how they're built, just by putting up a dam in between 2 hills. So these are really all, if you're looking at it in perspective and comparison to, let's say, $25,000 worth of equipment, digging a pond for $5,000 or building a dam for $5,000 or buying a shallow well pump and driving a point, let's say, for a few $1,000s, and then setting up the irrigation system, seems to me a much more economical way of addressing the issue of a lack of water than some of the other methods out there. Where this won't benefit a hunter is if you have, let's say, multiple farms, or you have a single farm with food plots spread out all over the place. It'd be pretty hard to run irrigation, a half a mile this way and a half a mile this way. In those examples, it probably wouldn't work as well for you unless you're willing to dig several ponds or something like that. The last thing I want to mention is when you dig a pond or you build a dam to hold water back, probably not so much when you're pounding in a point and doing a shallow well, but when you're putting a pond or something like that on your property that you own, you've now increased the value of that property. So there's actually a return on that investment. That won't depreciate like buying a grain drill. 30 years from now or 25 years from now, that grain drill, you're going to go through parts. It's going to be rusty. It's not going to be worth what it is today. Like any machinery, that's going to depreciate in value. With that pond actually adds value to your land. And not only can you use that pond or water source that you just created for irrigation, but it's also a water source for all the other animals and birds and everything else that are living on your property. So if you're thinking about doing this, so now I actually want to go back to my first example. My real good friend that did this, he put a scrape in. It's called a scrape, and that's his water source. But that scrape holds wood ducks. There's muskrat in there. Deer use it as a water source. So he put that scrape in an area where he actually wanted a water source for wildlife, and then he can also use that for irrigating his food plots. It's actually a pretty good setup. So again, 10 years ago, I probably would have rolled my eyes if somebody said, I'm going to dig a pond, or I'm going to build a dam, or I'm going to pound a point, put a shallow well pump in to irrigate my food plots. I probably would have rolled my eyes if I was honest with myself, or if I'm being honest with myself right now. But having seen it twice now, and in country where the quality of the soil is about as poor as you can get, you maybe can get a little bit worse if you live in a really rocky environment with basically nothing to even hold seed. But this is as sandy as sand can be, very low organic matter. It would take you years, maybe dozens of years, to get that organic level up in the top 6 inches before you could actually grow some decent crops on a consistent basis. But even then, in a drought year, a severe or extreme drought year, it's not going to matter. You're going to burn those crops up. Ask the farmers in Kansas and Nebraska this year that have their crops burning up. So my point with all of this is I want to bring to you ideas that have worked for me and experiences that work for me. This is an example of an idea and an experience that's worked for a friend of mine and a client of mine in irrigating their food plots.